So something I've alluded to a lot of times in the past, but I've never really gotten into detail about, is that I really enjoy fan fiction. And it's not just kind of like a new or a passive thing. I've really been into it since I was fairly young, actually. We're actually looking at the first fanfic I ever read, Life After Ava, which was by Chewy. And as you can see, it was first published in 2003. And I remember reading it as the first couple popped up. That was back before there was really that much of a community, and it kind of grew into what it is today, where you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of fics on fanfiction.net. So maybe just to take a step back, what is fanfiction? Fanfiction is, I guess you could say, broadly speaking, it's taking a pre-existing work and characters from that pre-existing work and using them to tell your own story or your own fiction, I guess you could say. And fanfics are kind of grouped together into different fandoms based on what universe they're in. So, like, the biggest universes, generally speaking, I'd say are Harry Potter, Naruto, My Little Pony, and a bunch of others. Generally speaking, the more popular something is, the more fan fiction that's available on it. And what people will do is they'll take the setting, the universe, characters from it, and they'll put their own spin on it. And this is something that ranges very wildly. It's a very creative art form. So you can go from like what they call one shots, which is maybe just they write an original scene, or they write a scene from the show or movie or whatever from a different perspective, to epics. I remember there was one guy who did a complete rewrite of the entire Harry Potter series that I actually thought was substantially better. But I guess kind of the question everybody's wondering is, why bother? Why do this? This sounds really lame. This sounds like a waste of time, etc. So I do think there is a lot of merit into fan fiction as a media form. And I don't just say that because a lot of my writing style, if you've read my book No Chance, comes from it. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing to admit. But maybe let me just take a step back and say what I think are kind of the merits of it. The first thing is there's something more objective about reading something than there is about watching something. And this really, I think, kind of came home to me when I was watching the second to last season of Game of Thrones, and you had that whole Arya Sansa plot where we had no idea as the audience what was going on, if they were working together, if they were trying to kill each other, all that kind of stuff. And after the show ended, we still have no idea. And if that was in fictional, if that was in a written form, you'd be like, Sansa looked at Arya, terror clear in her eyes, or something like that. Like, they'd have to describe it so it would be a lot more objective. And like, if you're doing a summary of a movie, and that's why it's often good to go read a summary of the movie, they will say what happened. Like, if you're not sure, it's ambiguous, they have to put down something substantive. And if there's not something substantive, they'll say, it might have been this. So that's a really good thing. In particular, it's nice to be able to read it from different perspectives. Different maybe point of view changes. So if it's having something in a first person perspective can be really good, because maybe it's like a character who we don't really understand, and getting inside of their head, it really helps. And I guess that kind of brings me to the second thing that I like about fan fiction and I think has value is it does really give you a chance to explore and understand the characters in something a lot better. Because you get to see different ways people look at them. You get to see all new situations and how they interact with other characters and interact with the world. You get to see, as I said, kind of a more objective description of what's in their mind, what's happening during different times. There's actually a really interesting Lord of the Rings fanfic I read, which was Sauron's trial, where he gets dragged back to Valinor, and he's kind of explaining the story from his perspective. And obviously they made a bunch of changes to canon, but it was just very interesting to see, like, from his point of view, what happened and how he felt about everything. And that's just kind of something you wouldn't really get in the main work unless the author themselves decides to make kind of a derivative form of it. And I guess kind of going off of this, the what if is kind of the thing that drives fan fiction. One of my all-time favorite fanfics, Advice and Trust, is an Evangelion one, and it takes place in the episode where Shinji and Asuka kiss, and Shinji loses his balance and winds up grabbing her, and she thinks that he's hugging her, and then they wind up getting together, and then the whole plot changes. And a lot of authors will go to these kind of defining moments, these I guess, to use a Last Jedi thing, what if Rey had gone with Kylo Ren or whatever, and then they'll kind of retell the rest of the story from that perspective. And it's pretty interesting because I think a lot of us like to do what ifs. We like to go, what if this happened? What if that happened? But it's nice to see the whole thing kind of unfurl. Like, to not just kind of see at a very base level, but how it changes and how it alters everything. And a lot of times that's kind of a frustration with you as a reader, which kind of brings me to, I'm just kind of going point by point here to bring me to another topic. Fan fiction is often a way of fixing canon, because there's some people who are just kind of inept at dealing with their own work. And it's kind of this debate. It's kind of a death of the author thing, and it's something I get into arguments about a lot. Can an author be out of canon in their own universe? Like, if a character just does something completely bizarre, or it doesn't make any sense, or it's illogical or something, can you say that the author, in declaring that or in doing that, is going against their own canon? And it's an interesting question. So a lot of the time in, like, what develops is a fanon, and within the fanon, a lot of things just get changed. Like, and they aren't really similar at all to the original. In particular, really lame protagonists. I don't mean that they're like pussies or like cowardly or whatever, but just who are really like dumb, like, if not the perspective of the viewer, just like stupid to the point of like having a learning disability, well, like of being mentally challenged, almost always get fixed. Fanon Naruto is nothing like canon Naruto. They're really different. Fanon Naruto, probably because it's hard to write someone as stupid as canon Naruto, tends to be way darker and way smarter. He normally maintains a lot of the same aspects, like the inherent goodness, the kindness, the honesty, all that kind of stuff, but he's substantially smarter and more mature. Harry's another character like that. In particular, a lot of Rowling, because she kind of like, a lot of people don't really like where she went with the characters and that kind of thing. And so like Harry has no agency whatsoever in the original book series, but he always has a ton of agency. And it's kind of funny because certain characters in the fanon will just generally be portrayed a certain way, even if that's not how they were in the canon at all. Like, Dumbledore is hated by the fandom. I'd say about 70 to 80% of fanfics bash Dumbledore. They really, really don't like him. And they, like, his flaws and his faults in Harry's life are very widely acknowledged. And like I said, it's kind of become fanon because people, generally speaking, agree with it. Sometime I'll have to do a whole video on Sasuke, because Sasuke Uchiha is the most divisive character in all of fandom. Because the fandom's almost perfectly divided between people who hate him, like me, and people who love him and think he's like the greatest guy ever. So it's kind of interesting because in any Naruto fanfic, he's either like the Antichrist or he's like the perfect guy. He's kind of like Naruto's Rhaegar Targaryen, but we'll get into that. We'll get into that later on. Whereas in like contrast, everyone hates Sakura. I see very, very few Naruto fanfics where Sakura isn't bashed. Also, a lot of people dislike Kakashi. It's just kind of interesting, like I said, to see all these different facets, to see how kind of the meta evolves with how these characters are viewed, and just how a bunch of like fan canon things will just come up, and sometimes they'll even be incorporated back into future stories in the main thing. And I guess finally, I think it's a good way for young writers or amateur writers to write something that somebody will actually want to read. Because someone might not want to read your actual book, or that kind of thing. But if you're writing a Legend of Zelda fanfic and it's good, then probably a lot of people will read it. You'll get comments, you'll get feedback, you might meet some people. And it's just it's something that's like, I guess, kind of good as a hobby, where it's just something you can work on. There's not really any expectation. It's a bit easier than maybe coming up with your own work, because a lot of the set pieces are already there. And I've seen some people, and I'll do some lists at some point that have like fics that I think fix canon or are better than canon. And I know I'm not talking about. I know there's a lot of like dark stuff. There's all the lolly. There's like a lot of weird fetishes, a lot of just weird dudes. And I don't really want to get into the dark stuff in these videos, just because I think that's well known. I think the whole thing just has a really bad rep. Somewhat deservedly, somewhat undeservedly, and just kind of to sit here and to be the next person to just kind of point it out and make fun of it and attack it, I just don't think would be very interesting or very productive. It's kind of like how I felt with Twilight, where I actually like the Twilight books, and they definitely have flaws, and there's a lot of issues with them. But for what they were, I enjoyed them, and I thought they were a pretty good book series. So rather than make like a video saying, well, it's kind of a mixed bag, and I'd rather just kind of make a video defending them and saying it's a good thing. So those are kind of my thoughts on what I like about fan fiction and why I think it has merit as an art form or a literary form or a genre or whatever you want to call it. So now that I've made the original one, we're going to eventually have some more videos on this. Maybe I'll either review individual fics, do some compilations, or just talk a bit about the fandom in question. So I hope you enjoyed the video. God bless you all, and more videos to come.